So today we're joined by Gully Bujak, who is a full-time employee of Extinction Rebellion and activist. How did you get involved with Extinction Rebellion?
First, just a small correction. I'm not an employee of Extinction Rebellion.
Oh,
There
okay,
aren't any employees of Extinction Rebellion. Sadly, I
right.
would be if I could be.
Sorry, I saw
But
somewhere that it said you were full-time working for. Does that not then
I
count as an employee?
I do XR stuff full time,
Right.
basically. But they don't pay me,
Okay.
or there's no
Right.
contract or
Okay.
anything like
Okay. Fair enough.
that. So I got involved with XR in March last year. I first heard about Extinction Rebellion, I think, from a George Monbiot article in The Guardian. I think that's actually how a lot of people heard about it. From talking to people, they're like, "Oh yeah, how I first heard about it as well." And that was at the end of 2018. And yeah, he was introducing this new group who were prepared to do mad things and put their liberty on the line to draw attention to the climate crisis. And up until then, I was worried and scared and kind of switched on to the state of the world, etc. But it wasn't until, for some reason, I read the article that something sort of, I don't know, turned on inside me, something changed. And I went to the Five Bridges protest in central London in November, where we shut down five of the main bridges in central London, which that was what Monbiot was talking about in his article. And then, that's been like that ever since. I moved to London in March, in part to be more involved with XR, not fully, but that was part of the reason. And just had some time on my hands because I quit my job in Norwich, turned up at their office, which at the time was in Euston, and they said, "We're desperate for people. Here you go. Here's a job." And that was it, really.
Had you been involved in any other activism up to that point in different areas, or was this the first kind of thing that you'd been involved in?
Not really. I'd been on marches. I'd been on Greenpeace marches and stuff like that before, sort of small things. But I hadn't, no, nothing like this. I wouldn't have considered myself an activist by any stretch of the imagination. So it was kind of complete something of a big change for my life. Yeah.
What kind of work is it that you do exactly for XR?
So I've worn quite a few hats in the past 18 months or so. When I first joined, I was it was called Transport and Storage then. It's now the Logistics team. Logistics team is about there's like two people in it. So that was managing the office, the storage spaces, warehouse, and getting things to and from, essentially. So for April, it was how do you get compost toilets, how do you get kitchens in and out of sites, etc. And then I've done other things. I've done a bit of help with the social media team, and then more recently I've sort of moved away from logistics and done more action design things.
Okay, quite a variety of things then.
Yeah, I mean you kind of have to do what's needed, I guess, in XR. Sure. It's not your traditional workplace. Yeah. It's just like a bunch of stuff that needs doing, and if you're willing and able, then.
Yeah, do you think that hinders or helps the organisation as a whole? Because I think that's something that's quite unique to XR, is the way that it's set up, very decentralised, very all hands on deck approach. Do you think that's something that XR's benefited from, or do you think that a more, maybe organised is the wrong word, but a more centralised structure would help benefit the organisation?
It's a good question. Honestly, I have mixed feelings about it, to be frank. I think it was has been a really bold experiment in how to work in a decentralized manner and how to have a non-hierarchical work structure. And in some ways, I think it's been really successful. Wouldn't have been able to grow as quickly as we did. I don't think if we hadn't had this decentralized ethos and this model where local groups pop up all over the country and they can have kind of autonomy over how they're organized, what actions they do, and all feed into this central sort of structure. However, I do think there's lots of learnings to be taken from the 2 years that XR has existed, and I think there's a lot to be honed in that structure, which could make it more effective. I think there are certain things that we don't have the luxury of that you would have in a normal hierarchical structure. For example, somebody making the decisions, or a way to ask people to leave the movement, or a way to just a normal method of sort of leadership, which in my opinion potentially if we could just work on that a bit more would potentially make us a little bit more tactical and more direct about how we come to decisions, which would speed things up, I think.
I think one of the main criticisms that I see often banded about Extinction Rebellion is that there is maybe a lack of clarity as to what the organisation as a whole represents. I know, and maybe you can delve a little bit more into the aims of Extinction Rebellion. I know there are aims that have been outlined, but like you say, there are lots of different groups within Extinction Rebellion, lots of crossover between maybe other political groups that work alongside the work that Extinction Rebellion do. So I think that the criticisms aren't necessarily substantive or policy driven. They're more about the way that the organisation is structured, and also some of the tactics that are used in the direct action, or the non-violent direct action that's undertaken. I'm sure we can get into that, but would you be okay with maybe going through some of Extinction Rebellion's aims, some of the more policy focused suggestions that Extinction Rebellion have, and what you'd like to see as an organisation done to tackle the climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to what you said earlier in the question, like it is really hard to engender a sense of commonality, a common like DNA of what a movement is when it's so sprawling and it is decentralized and autonomous. That is something that's been really hard, and that's like something that we need to recognize, I think. You can get past that if you take the time to do more in-depth trainings like inductions and stuff when people join the movement. But because we grew so fast and so rapidly after April, I think inductions is something where we kind of fell down a little bit in, I think. So there isn't such a strong knowledge of how XR works, what the structure is in like all the local groups, all the different aspects of XR as there could be. But one thing that ties everyone together is these 3 demands, which we have and we've had since the start, which are for the government and media to tell the truth about the climate and ecological emergency, for them to act like that truth is real by halting biodiversity loss and bringing us to net zero by 2025. And in order to do that, the 3rd demand is to set up a binding citizens assembly, which would be a citizen assembly is a form of participatory democracy, which is run by people, for people, making decisions that affect ordinary people, rather than relying on our politicians, which so often obviously have to answer to special interest donors, outside pressures. So those are the 3 demands which we've had since the beginning, and I think we've done a good job of getting them out there, getting people to know what those demands are. They're deliberately quite broad, but also simple and easy to grasp, I think. Those are the 3.
I think they are, and they work well in, and as you say, quite a concise, straightforward, a hard-hitting manner. I kind of wanted to delve into the specifics of those, especially the last 2, with you, if you don't mind. I don't think anyone can argue with the first one. There's no doubt that before if we even want to start to tackle this issue, we have to tell the truth about the facts that surround it, and by calling a climate emergency and the government formally recognizing that needs to happen is the first step. You know, actually recognizing the problem will go a long way to furthering what needs to be done. But the second aim, specifically the 2025 net zero target, do you see that as being achievable now in the current system, or do you think that adopting goals and aims that are maybe less achievable to speed up the process of us achieving net zero at some point, hopefully before 2050, if not by 2050, is the way to go?
I mean, I can see the value in that the latter point that you made, like groups be, and that arguably that is something that is a role that we do perform in general as XR, being slightly more radical, allow people on this side of the spectrum to, like, shifting the Overton window, right? We bring people with us because we're being at one end. So maybe having a more ambitious target helps to shift that conversation in the right direction. But I actually do think it's achievable anyway. I mean, it was more achievable when XR started 2 years ago. Obviously, if we'd started the transition then, it would have been a lot easier, a lot less painful. But I still think it's achievable if the government takes it seriously and pulls its finger out of its arse, to be honest. Like, we have the resources at our disposal to like perform a just transition, to create millions of green jobs, to decarbonize the economy if we choose to. As always, it's the political will that is lacking, and that's obviously our main the main thrust of our actions always is to force the political will, as it were. Like, if we bring the public along with us, if we change public opinion, then we can pressure politicians to find the will to do what is necessary. But I do think it's achievable. Obviously, as time goes on and still nothing is done, then it becomes less and less realistic. But I don't think we can change that demand or drop that demand. I think until we'll have to see what happens when 2025 comes along. But I think by then we might be looking at some bigger problems, to be honest.
Yeah, for sure. And sorry, Brett, go ahead.
I was just going to say that reducing sort of bringing the greenhouse gas emissions to net zero in 5 years would require a lot of societal change, and a lot of funding to be put into various sectors. Given the current situation with the pandemic, does that affect that at all, do you think? Because in my mind, I'd probably feel like it would negatively, affect whether that's achievable or not. I don't know what if you've had any thoughts on that at all.
Well, I think in lots of ways, the pandemic, this horrible situation that the world has been thrust into, has provided something of an opportunity, and we can argue about whether that's already been squandered or not. But in the sense of raising people, like, it was such a shock, right? So it suddenly made people realize where our vulnerabilities are, and what it might feel like to have something like this happen, to be like queuing up outside the shop, the shelves be empty, things like that. So it has been a bit of a shock to the system, which potentially will have been useful in waking people up to what's coming down the line. But it also, we saw oil prices falling through the floor. We saw airlines begging for government money. If we'd taken that if the government had chosen to taken that as an opportunity to reset the economy, to transition to a green economy, and to have a green recovery from COVID, which is possible and feasible and sensible, then this moment could have been used to our advantage. Obviously, it's still been really challenging, and there's still been huge amounts of human hurt and loss, but it could have been a moment of change, a moment of real positive change. I don't know whether that's past now or not, but it definitely posed a question for those in charge.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is a case of, in my mind anyway, what's possible and what's probable. So is it possible to achieve net zero by 2025? Absolutely. Should we be working towards those aims? Yes, we should. Is it probable under the current circumstances? Probably not. but like you say, does that mean that we shouldn't work towards achieving it? No. Do you think that I don't want to keep asking whether you think Extinction Rebellion specifically should do more in this area, because obviously you do a lot and I don't want to put you on the spot about things, but do you think that activist groups, specifically climate activist groups, could do more to work in a collaborative way with government and industry to work towards achieving these goals? I know that there's a lot of hostility, and rightly so, towards a lot of industry, but in my mind it's not possible without both the work of government, industry and activists to achieve the goals that we should all want to see. And I think that there's lines to be drawn there. Certain oil and gas companies specifically who have polluted the earth for so long need to be held responsible. But do you think that we can achieve those goals without working together more closely, without those groups working together more closely?
It's complex, isn't it? There is hostility towards industries, towards huge multinational conglomerates who have done a lot to bring us to this point and put us in this mess that we're in. Obviously, there's some hostility there, but there's not hostility towards people, and there's not hostility towards the hundreds of thousands of people who work in these businesses. So, like, for example, when we did an action outside the Bank of England, when they were announcing the bailouts for airlines, for Ryanair, for British Airways, for EasyJet, etc. One of the main messages for the action was that we're not here to piss off the workers. We're not here to say it's your fault. We want to work with you. Like, if we're serious about this transition, if we're serious about that a different world is possible, we need everybody to come with us, and we need to get people who work in these jobs to see that something else is possible and to work with us. So collaboration with the people who work in these places absolutely would be amazing. And but the point is that we have to identify who is profiting off these companies existing, and it's not the people who work in them. That they're going to be the victims of when the airlines collapse, which they will, because they can't. When society collapses, when the climate crisis hits home, eventually it will, these people are going to be the first ones to feel it, because they won't have a job suddenly. You know, if we have a just transition, then they can be moved smoothly to a new job, to a green job. If these airlines just keep putting profit over people and profit over planet, and keep going and going and going until they've extracted as much profit as they can, then these people will lose their jobs suddenly. So I think we do need to collaborate with people on all sides of the political spectrum in different industries. It would be good to work with government. Like, I would like to sit down and speak to the government. That's what our 3 demands are all about. In April, we did manage to sit down and have a negotiation with them, and they did. Councils all over the country declared a climate emergency, etc., etc. In the end, it was just lip service, and they haven't actually made the change anywhere close to the changes that we need to see. So it's easy to say, we need to work together, but if they don't honour their end of the bargain, then it's hard to see the positives in that. Having said that we have introduced, co-written the CE bill, Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, which Caroline Lucas tabled in September. And it has the support of about 70 odd MPs, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for what it was, it's quite impressive. So that's a way that we're sort of going a bit off piece for XR, in terms of, like, we're actually trying to work within the existing political system. I think you can do both at once, and I think you have to.
Yeah.
We have to push from the outside, and we'll try and work with them and speak their language and do it the way they want us to. Again, if that comes to nothing, then it's hard.
Yeah, of course. What do you think is the reason that message maybe hasn't been conveyed? Specifically, the message about wanting to work with specifically the people that work within these industries, or the people in general, because I think it. I mean, I don't want to lead us down a specific route, although I think we'll end up talking about the media and media portrayal. But it seems to me that when conversations about Extinction Rebellion specifically occur, there isn't that message that's relayed that it's an organisation that want to work with people, that want to work with industry, that want to sit down with government and have proactive conversations and that have proactive demands. We hear these conversations constantly that they just want to disrupt, they want to tear everything down, all of these sort of sensationalist arguments and claims. What do you think is the reason that those messages, the real aims, like you've just so eloquently described, aren't what people's perception of Extinction Rebellion are?
I think it's a combination of things. I think, as when we were talking about the three demands just before, I said that they're deliberately simple, they're deliberately top line, broad, catchy. We're still a really young movement. The point of those three demands being so accessible and kind of all encompassing is so that we can take the first step of like getting people to think about this. We're at the beginning of something. We're trying to get people to suddenly consider this whole thing that they haven't really thought about before. So I think part of the reason those sorts of more nuanced like subheadings under those demands or under that messaging hasn't got through is in part because we've focused on things which are more broad, things which will appeal to a broader section of society, so that we can bring as many people with us as we can. But also, like you just touched on, and I hope we will go into it in more detail, the media do control. And so if they decide not to, for every action we'll put out a press release, and that press release will be maybe two sides of A4 in length, and it will have loads of nuance. Every action that you plan has so much thought going into the messaging and why we're doing it and who we're trying to talk to with it. And all of that is in the press release in great detail. But the media obviously will choose what is sexiest and what is going to sell stories. So it's not going to be that XR want to reach out to working people who work for Virgin Airlines and speak to them, because that's not sexy. It's like they've got to do what's going to sell papers, and that's obviously a fundamental issue in holding us back when we're talking about this problem.
Yeah.
Just before we go on to talking a bit more about the media, I wanted to just ask about the third demand, which is to create a citizens' assembly. We had to do a bit of research beforehand to try and figure out exactly what that meant. How, from what I understand, the demand itself says government must create and be led by the decisions of a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. Is that a realistic demand, do you think? Because I can't. It's hard for me to try and picture any politician currently wanting to. Because it's basically a way to hold the government to account on their action towards preventing climate change or fighting it. So it's hard for me right now to see how or why they would want to implement that kind of a demand. Do you think it's likely at all? Do you think it's feasible?
It's definitely feasible. I mean, they've done it. It's been done before. They've done it recently in France, a citizen assembly on the climate crisis. Our government did introduce a citizen assembly after our protests, but it was non-binding, basically toothless. So essentially, no point in it. It was just again a bit more lip. It was just a gesture. I think it is feasible. What you said about why would a politician agree to it, because it's essentially undermining them or pointing out where they've gone wrong or whatever. I think that is one way you could look at it, and that's valid. There's also another way of looking at it, which is that if there's enough public pressure behind something, if there's enough momentum behind something, if we did a poll and 99% of the country thought this was the biggest issue, and that's what was going to inform them voting in a general election, for example, a citizens' assembly on that issue is a way for a party or a government to, if it's binding, it's a way for them to enact things that they potentially would be too scared to otherwise, because they're forced to. If it's a binding citizens' assembly and we come out with all these 10 recommendations for the government to do, then they have to then enact them. And it's kind of, you could see it as a way, if I was a politician, I would maybe see it as a way of letting me off the hook, you know, from my donors, my voters, whatever, who might not necessarily agree with it. But yeah, it's a tricky one. The fact that you had to do research before this interview on it, there's a lot. I think I've been thinking about this a lot recently, which is, I don't think we've focused enough on that demand. Hindsight, whatever, but
sure,
I think we could do a lot more work on getting people to understand what it is, and I think it's in a way the most important one. That's how everything else will follow. Our whole point is that we're not solutions based. We're not here to provide all the solutions. To say the solutions are already out there. A citizens' assembly is a way to formulate a path forward with those solutions. So, yeah, I think maybe going forward, potentially it's something that we should focus on a lot more, and especially in the current climate of something I've been thinking about is, and some of us have been thinking about, is doing citizens' assemblies, not on the climate crisis, but going into communities, doing citizens' assemblies on things like COVID, how we've responded to the pandemic, just as a way of getting people to understand that mechanism of participatory democracy.
Is the citizens' assembly then not a permanent thing? Is it temporary?
Yeah, it's a temporary.
Yeah, it would.
Right. Okay.
It wouldn't be permanent. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
It's set up for a specific. You would give it a framework, so it's set up with a specific task. Mm-hmm. For a specific time frame, right. And then, but if it's binding, obviously, then those recommendations should be permanent and they'll be taken forward by the government.
Yeah, I think the implementation of whatever the outcome of said citizens' assembly would be is the difficult part. I think you both alluded to, there are different ways of looking as to why this would be something that would be beneficial. I do think that a more participatory form of democracy would be really beneficial for loads of issues, not just climate, but lots of different issues where politicians come at deadlocks, or they look at things from partisan ideological points of view. The difficult part, or the sticky part, I think, is how then do you implement those decisions. So if you were to have a vote on the suggestions, often then you come into the political problem of whether that party wants to vote for the things that have been suggested. If it was binding or legally binding, if the suggestions were legally binding and there were issues in how the citizens' assembly was set up, or the way that they got their evidence was set up, then you might have problems with the implementation of it down the long run. Then does there need to be more scrutiny of the suggestions? So I think that it's something that, probably because it hasn't been focused on, and we haven't trialed it in smaller circumstances, in local areas or whatever, we don't have enough evidence to go on as to why or how it would work. But I definitely think that it's probably the most interesting, and for me the most possibly impactful suggestions that you have, because at the end of the day, whilst it's really important that we raise awareness about the issues that we see, there needs to be some kind of policy or solution based approach to defeating this or tackling this crisis before it, like you say, we face some kind of mass extinction event. So I guess this kind of moves us nicely into the was it the press action protests? Did you want to take us through what happened, what your thoughts were behind the press action, and then maybe we can talk about some of the ramifications of it?
Yeah, sure. So this was an action we did at the beginning of September, a couple of months ago. It took place in 3 locations in Britain, and then also in some states in America and in Australia. It was Oxbourne, just outside of London, that's where I was, Knowsley, just outside of Liverpool, and also in Glasgow. So on the same day, we blockaded News Corp's printing presses, Murdoch's printing presses. The idea being to do a symbolic protest to temporarily stop some of those papers getting out for that 24-hour news cycle. We were there for 12 hours, and draw people's attention to this fundamental crisis of democracy, which is how I see it, of which comes from the concentration of ownership of the media, which we have in the UK. So yeah, we were there for 12, 13 hours. I was on top of a van just at Broxbourne, and like I said, the idea was to start a conversation, and I think we definitely succeeded in doing that. It was one of the most talked about, most successful actions that XR has done. And we had Boris Johnson weighing in on it. We had Priti Patel tweeting about it, which in a way was so beautiful. And I was so thrilled when I came out of custody and saw that they've been talking about it, because it so perfectly illustrated one of our main points, one of our main criticisms behind the action, which is that connect the links between the close relationships between state and media in this country are so corrupt and so obvious to see for anybody who takes a minute to start learning about it. And for Boris Johnson and Priti Patel to immediately come out and like trash the action and say we're trampling on free press and freedom of speech, just transparent, I think, to illustrate those links and where their interest lies and where the pressure is coming from. But yeah, so we wanted to educate in a way, like without being patronizing. We want to shine a light on something that most people don't really know about. If they know about it, they don't ever think about it, really, which is that 5 billionaires control the news that roughly 70% of the British population read. And those billionaires, those individuals, are pretty unrepresentative in terms of if they're supposed to represent the everyday person. They really don't. They're all white male billionaires who don't pay the taxes and don't live in this country and have private islands. They control those papers not only like in a financial sense, but also editorially. They control the content that goes into them, and it's well documented how they do that and the extent to which they do that. So the news that we read, news in inverted commas, is manipulated by the special interests, the personal and political agendas of 5 individual billionaires. So that is what leads them to print like climate skepticism, outright climate denialism, to not report on the climate and ecological emergency, which is the biggest thing, this absence of reporting on this existential crisis facing humanity. But not only that, it is not only about the climate, this action, this is also about, like I said, this broad undermining of democracy, how Boris Johnson is best mates with Rupert Murdoch. Boris Johnson is I was just reading, he's nominated Yevgeny Lebedev of the London Evening Standard for a lifetime peerage. They're best mates, they always have been. So this is these personal connections, and if you followed the Leveson inquiry or have read about that, or watched the BBC documentary about Rupert Murdoch, which I recommend you to watch, and you'll know that these connections do interfere with our democracy in a massive way. So these papers, these individual people, do decide what to print, which means based on their own agendas, which means we're reading what they want us to read. We're focusing on what they want us to focus on, and by definition, we're not focusing on other things. So we're not focusing on the climate crisis. We're not focusing on massive wealth inequality. Why would they want us to focus on that when they are 5 billionaires? They're part of that problem. So it wasn't just about the climate crisis as action. This is also about democracy. And it was also about some of the other dirty tactics that they use to keep us distracted, like deliberately scapegoating migrants, refugees, marginalized groups. They do that consistently, and it's almost become sort of accepted, I think, in our culture these days, that we just, we know that the Sun and the Daily Mail, etc., they do that, and we sort of turn a blind eye. But when you think about why they're doing it, it becomes even more sinister. So Yeah, so it was a multifaceted motivations for taking action, and I hope that it has made some people think a bit more deeply about how they get their news, what a free press really means, and what it would look like in this country if we had one.
Yeah, I mean, we it's no secret from our point of view that we have massive frustrations with how the media runs in this country and the way that we hold conversations. It's part of the reason why I set up Demographica in the first place, was through our own frustrations of where we were getting or what we were reading and the conversations that we saw going on in the country. And like you say, I think the fact that the discussion that we had the morning after wasn't about a substantive conversation about the media in this country, who owns it, why are we being fed, or why are we being told certain stories. We weren't having a constructive conversation about that, or talking about the monopolies that go on in the media. We were talking about whether there was, whether free speech was being encroached upon by these actions. I know that, I mean, I guess we should ask you, what would your rebuttal be to somebody that would say that your actions went against free speech and encroached on people's free speech rights? Do people have... What's the line that you would draw between people having the right to access the kind of media that they want to access when they want to access it, and maybe it being perceived that the Extinction Rebellion as an organisation are trying to control what people can and can't read?
It's hard to respond to that because I just think it's so dumb. But I'll try. The free speech thing just makes no sense whatsoever. In doing the action, we were embodying free speech. We were there exercising our democratic right to protest, pointing out something that is encroaching on our democracy, undermining our democracy. We were enacting free speech. The free press thing, for all the reasons I've just spoken about, we don't have a free press in this country. We can't trample on something that doesn't exist. Like, 5 billionaires control the news at 70% of us read. That's not a free press. That's a huge concentration of ownership. That's not what a free press would look like. We don't even really know anymore what a free press would look like. We do know, we can kind of extrapolate that what our country might look like if we had a freer press. If you look at New Zealand, they no longer have a Murdoch-owned press. They used to, but it never like gained traction. You never managed to get a foothold there, and we kind of constantly hold New Zealand up in comparison as this like nice, lovely place to live with Jacinda Ardern, and people are generally happy. The polls show that even people who don't vote for Labour, Jacinda Ardern's party, are generally happy. It's like, it's not a hugely divided society like we have in this country. And I don't think it's a coincidence that they also don't have any Murdoch or billionaire-owned press. So I think to say that we shut down free press is deliberately and willfully ignorant, and it's also like silly because most people get their news online. We didn't shut down dailymail.co.uk or whatever it is. We didn't shut down any of their websites. That's how most people read those papers nowadays. It was a symbolic action designed to trigger a conversation, which it did. We were there for 12 hours. Like, I don't think we trampled on the free press.
Yeah, I think I don't necessarily have a problem per se with the idea that billionaires own some newspapers. I don't necessarily have an issue with that specifically. The problem is the concentration of the media in this country with 5 billionaires and 70% of people reading that. That is obviously a major issue. And for me, the issue more so, and I think this is in many ways what you are highlighting, is transparency. Do most people know who owns the media that they're reading? Do most people know why there is a certain story on a front page, or what parties that newspaper traditionally supports, or the kinds of relationships that the owners of those newspapers have with major politicians? Is that what people are aware of? And something we often come back to in this with our podcast and these interviews is education, and I think that's where the solution, or the beginnings of a solution, lies. If people knew that this was the situation with the media in the UK, would we be happy about it? Because what you relayed, the ownership of newspapers in this country, is a fact. If people were aware of that, would there be more of a push to change the ownership or to institute laws that meant that certain people, there wasn't allowed to be that massive amount of concentration in the press? I think there personally would be. I think that we've seen that people want to have more open conversations. People have started to get their news from different sources. And in an age where there is so much misinformation, I think this conversation specifically about the way that we look at the media in this country is becoming more and more important. And Brett, I don't know. I know that you've got a lot of problems with the media and how the media is run in this country, but I think that it boils down to that. It boils down to awareness and ensuring that people know, and things like the documentary on the Murdochs on BBC, which is absolutely fascinating. Even if, like you say, you're aware of how many pies Rupert Murdoch has his fingers in, I think even that is illuminating quite the amount of control and the network that the Murdoch family have.
Mm-hmm. I think the press action kind of highlighted very well how much of the press that Murdoch actually owns, and also how much power he has. Clearly, considering the fact that, like you were saying, like Boris Johnson and Priti Patel instantly came out to defend him and spouted about free speech, but it does concern me when, like you said, Jack, that when the discussion we had about it the next day was about freedom of speech, so we had also been manipulated by that press.
That's a good point.
And I don't actually read any of their press. I just saw this on Twitter, but
yeah, it's a good point.
So it still concerns me that the power they have is still, and I don't know how you combat that.
It's about influencing conversations, isn't it? And like you said, that didn't even compute to me that we ended up having that debate because it's what other people were debating, and how dangerous that can be, that knock-on effect. I don't know what you think, Gully.
I think you're right, but I think we just have to keep at it. I think that the fact that people were having a conversation at all is important, and that's the first step. And a lot of the articles on the tabloids that we've blockaded, they used a picture from our action which says 5 crooks control the news, free the truth. Even by having these conversations, they can't help but touch on the point that we have to make, and that's the power of direct action. That's why we do things that are so flashy and have to get in the news and etc. and draw attention to ourselves and scream our heads off. By reporting on us, they have to talk about the issue. So even if people were mainly talking about us trampling on free speech, I think it's still a good step, and I think it's still important that they were having that conversation. And regards, like, if people knew, like you were saying, Jack, if people knew the reality, would they care? I think you're right, they would care. The very fact that people were so animated about what we did on either side, it felt almost to me like, the way Americans get jacked up about their constitution and like the Bill of Rights and stuff like that, like the free press, free speech thing really spoke to something in British people. Like, it really touched on something important, and that was almost that sort of accidental. We weren't really expecting that sort of reaction. So I think it's important that we notice what triggered that reaction in people and why, and not go away and just keep doing it. I think there's way more to be explored in this issue, and XR and other activist groups have a big role to play in, like, continuing that conversation.
Yeah, something maybe to finish off that I wanted to speak to you about was, we had a young man called Kai Parry write an article for us, and he spent 72 hours at one of the Extinction Rebellion protests, one of the recent ones. It was a 3-day protest in London, in Parliament Square, and he is involved in the Youth Strike for Climate movement in Wales. And one of the things that he was saying, that he felt somewhat turned off by the Extinction Rebellion movement because of the direct action that the organisation uses. He felt personally that it was too disruptive, that the main crux of the arguments that he agreed with weren't getting put over properly, and that the reputation of climate movements in general was being tarnished by the actions, the more extreme actions that the Extinction Rebellion use. what would you say maybe in response to that? I know you probably haven't read the article that Kai wrote, but as a young person that is really passionate about the climate movement in the UK, what would you say to him about maybe the justifications for the? I know you've kind of touched on it, but specifically that the justifications for why the non-violent direct actions used.
I mean, to him specifically, someone who's really passionate and getting involved, I would say just read more history books, read about how change happens. And I would say keep going and don't lose heart. To people in general who criticize our tactics, that is just a predictable and very easily expected way that people react to something that is disruptive. We've seen it time and time again. Like, they said it about the suffragettes, they said it about Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. You know, people say, I agree with them. You know, I think they're right what they're doing. I just don't like their tactics. It's too disruptive. Or disruptive tactic. Like, if we didn't have disruptive tactics, then nobody would be talking about us at all. Nobody would be talking about the issues. We have to, unfortunately, it's a sad fact that we have to disrupt business as usual everyday lives if we want people to notice us. Like I said before, we're screaming and waving and jumping around because we're getting them to look at us so that we can point over there, look at this big thing that we're talking about. You know, if we keep within the box, if we keep like coloring within the lines and being polite and quiet, then we'll never get anywhere. And at the time, studies have shown, you know, when you ask people what they think about disruptive movements, etc., they always say, you know, they prefer people who are calmer, more reasonable, who are going through the like official pathways to make change. They always say that. That's understandable because they don't want to be disruptive. But the point is, and you can't ignore it, if you look at history, change doesn't happen without causing trouble, without making a noise. Like, we have to, and it's just the way it is. So I think I understand why people find it annoying, why it turns some people off, but we won't get anywhere unless we are loud, unless we fight for what we want.
Yeah, I completely understand it where you're coming from, and this is maybe I was saying to Brett earlier today when we were kind of discussing some of the things that we wanted to ask you, that one of my dilemmas maybe with probably with the tactics, and I've been to a few Extinction Rebellion protests myself, and I'm completely on board with both the majority of the aims and the essence of what all climate movements, or at least most climate movements in the UK, are speaking about and care really passionately about the issue. And this is also one of the things that Kai mentioned, was the idea, and I think it probably is used as somewhat of a smear, that the sitting in the street and disrupting traffic and that kind of thing has disrupted ambulances and police cars and fire engines and the like, and not wanting to be seen to be doing that, no matter how much you necessarily believe in something. Now, I guess you could say that if you're not willing to disrupt in that way, then maybe you don't. I don't know if you would say this actually, but maybe you don't care about the issue enough or as much as people that were willing to take that action. But do you see that as a legitimate concern for some people?
Absolutely, it's worrying, thinking about what might happen, thinking about if an ambulance comes, what are we going to do? But that's like, XR doesn't just go off willy-nilly. Well, I mean, it's decentralized, maybe people do. We don't, as a rule, just go off willy-nilly running into streets, putting up big structures. You know, a lot of time and thought and planning goes into every action. And a huge amount of that is thinking about keeping people safe, not just ourselves, the people who come with us, but members of the public, the people we are disrupting. You know, we aren't anti-people. We care about people, that's why we're doing it, you know. So embedded into action planning is thinking about how we can make that go more smoothly. If an ambulance comes, you know, in any... I've never been to an XR protest. I've been to plenty where ambulances have arrived. We always move out of the way for an ambulance. I've never been at a protest, XR or otherwise, where we go, you know, no, not let the ambulance through. Like,
Sure.
that's bizarre. Like, obviously there's circumstances where maybe you have infrastructure that couldn't be moved, and that's that's down to people to decide what they're comfortable with. But also the police are there to facilitate protests. That is essentially their role. If you look at it constitutionally, they are there to facilitate our democratic right to protest. So like if you're protesting in London, for example, it's very easy for the police to help us allow ambulances through, to like navigate them around us, etc. I can see why that worries people and why it puts them off. I don't think, you know, if you're worried about that, you don't care enough. I just think there are ways of navigating that, and it shouldn't stop us taking action.
Kai was talking specifically about how he was on the way to London, and because of the XR protests, his bus was slowed down by like Hyde Park or something, despite the Parliament Square, and he was concerned in those kind of situations that ambulances and emergency vehicles wouldn't be able to get through the traffic jams that are caused a bit further away from the protest, that aren't necessarily being monitored by the police yeah.
Sure, but people don't say that when there's a big football match on. You know, like it also happens when anything occurs, when anything big, when people come out in the streets. We can't let that stop us coming out in the streets. Like it's fundamental to how we exist as a democracy. Even though, as I've said, I really doubt that we do live in a democracy, but it's fundamental to how we live to be able to protest. And those kind of criticisms, I'm not saying they're not valid, and they do bear thinking about, but they don't really bear focusing on. They're not the issue, you know. And I think it's worth remembering that people don't ask those questions when it is a big football game on or anything else disruptive. You know, people throw it at us because it's easy.
Yeah, I guess it's important for the infrastructure in whatever city these things are taking place, for the infrastructure to accommodate those kind of situations where emergency vehicles might need to get through and there are traffic jams or whatever. We, as like a final question, what's up next for Extinction Rebellion? Are there any planned protests soon? What exactly what's up next for you as well?
I mean, there's always protests coming up. It's a decentralized, sprawling movement. It's hard to keep track of what's coming and going, but yeah, there's definitely things coming up in the next couple of months that I'm aware of. There's always things happening. You know, you can't stop our local groups from doing actions. They've got so much energy and enthusiasm. Even in really trying time, it's difficult to get out and protest, but people are still doing it. Specifically, I won't go into detail about what I know is coming next. For me, I don't know. I think a lot of people in XR who've been doing it for maybe a little while are, after this latest rebellion, sort of taking a bit of a step back just to look at things more clearly, just to think about what we've learned thus far, and where we might go from here. I think there's a lot of work we need to do internally, and a lot of thinking that we can do with regards to where our energy is best spent. You know, we're in an unprecedented time. We really don't know. It's hard to predict what's going to be effective, and it's hard to know where to go next. Like all of us, we're struggling with the pandemic, with the insanity of the world at the moment. So it's hard to know, but we won't be going away quietly anytime soon.
For anybody who's seen this interview and might want to join Extinction Rebellion or help them out, or where should they go? The website, I'm assuming.
You can go to our website. It's the best bet. Yeah, it's extinctionrebellion.uk, and the best way of joining, I would say, is to look up where your local group is and start getting involved there, because there are people there who've been doing it for a long time. There's also loads of new, fresh voices joining all the time. So just start going to their meetings. They're obviously online at the moment. And you can do an induction, you can do workshops, and just start learning what's going on in your area. That's the best way, I think, to get involved.
Great.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been really interesting speaking with you, and hopefully you'll come back and we can discuss what's going on again at some point soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.
Perfect.
Yeah, it was really fun.
Thank you.
Thanks.